Today is November 21, 2008. My name is Jerry Gill. I'm interviewing Bob Totusek, and we're in his residence here in Oklahoma City. This interview is part of the O State Stories project of the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program. Bob, gosh, you've had a long and distinguished career at Oklahoma State University. Well, maybe more distinguished than both. But can you first share some information, kind of your background a little bit, where you grew up, your family?
Okay. I was born in Garber, Oklahoma, and grew up, so to speak, on a farm near Garber, Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl and Depression days. Sometimes people say they didn't know they were poor because everybody else was poor. I knew we were poor. I could tell that the bankers' kids and the druggist kids and so on were not as poor as we were. But we were real fortunate. We did live on a farm, and that's one advantage farmers had during this era. They could grow enough food, so they didn't go hungry. We had a huge garden, and we had animals, and we not only had ample food for ourselves, but every Saturday, my folks would go to town, take the cream and eggs to sell, to get money to buy groceries, but they also did a food route. There were people in Garber who actually, not only were they unemployed, but they didn't have food to eat. And so every Saturday we delivered food to a number of families there. So we were poor, but we were more fortunate than a lot of people.
And had food anyway.
Yeah, we had food.
So what year did you graduate from Garber High School?
1944.
1944. So any activities that you remember from your high school days in school?
Well, I was very active in 4-H Club and FFA, and both of those organizations did a lot for my personal development. I didn't play any sports because we lived 6 miles from town, and I didn't cherish the idea or relish the idea of walking home 6 miles after workouts.
The bus wouldn't wait for you.
The bus wouldn't wait.
That's good. Did you hold any offices or any local or state offices in FFA or 4-H?
Had local offices in my high school class and FFA president, vice president, and was vice president of the Oklahoma FFA from the Northwest District.
Well, so you graduated in 1944. Were you able to go straight on to college from there, or did the war intervene?
I volunteered for the Army Air Corps in March of my senior year. That was 1944. And during the summer, I was just waiting to be called, working on the farm. My VOAG teacher came by and said, "What are you going to do this fall?" I said, "Well, I'm just waiting to be called." "Do you know when you're going to be called?" "No." "Get yourself down to Stillwater, Oklahoma, and enroll." And I did. And that was good advice, because who knows if I would have gone to college if I hadn't got a taste of it. But I went that semester, and half of the next semester was actually a year after I volunteered that I got called up.
So Uncle Sam needed you after all.
And there was a big delay in calling people up at that time because the Air Corps had plenty of pilots. And even after I got called up, they still didn't have any room in flight schools. And I didn't know when I signed up. They could have kept me in for 10 years and I wouldn't have known it. But the agreement, supposedly, they said, was if we did not get to complete pilot training before the war ended, we would be immediately discharged. So my tenure in the service was about 8 months.
Congratulations. So what was the story about? So your VOAG instructor was one that influenced you to go to Oklahoma State University,
right?
And his name was
Benton Thomason. He's still living in Alva, Oklahoma, wow. And in a couple of weeks I'm going down and visit him again. He must be about 96. Huge influence on my life as you know, in everybody's life, there are people who influence your life, and outside of my parents, he had probably the most influence on my early life than anyone.
So, do you remember a little about your undergraduate experience? I'm not thinking academics right here so much, but student activities, involvements. Not asking to get personal now, Bob.
I'll go to non-academics. When we moved about a year and a half ago, I was going through a lot of stuff, and I ran across my old high school manual. Not manual, yearbook, yes. And you know how it was customary to get other students to sign it and get teachers to sign it. One of my favorite teachers was Nell Barber, and she just died about a month ago. But she had written in my annual, you know, for most students, these teachers will write, "It's been great having you as a student. I know that you'll be a great success in life," and that sort of thing. This is what she wrote in my annual: "You are a challenge, my friend." I think the translation is, "You've been a big troublemaker."
Challenge. Good. Not an opportunity, but a challenge. So what were so we're talking about in the late '40s here, mid to late '40s. What were some of the student hangouts? Some of the hot places on campus and off campus.
Swim's campus shop.
Mm-hmm. Knobloch.
On Knobloch, just across the street from Joe's Clothes.
So what was the hot about Swim? So,
well, you could get a Coke for a nickel, and they had a Nickelodeon and a little dance floor. So
what else could you ask for?
that's right.
Well, I guess campus is a little different in the late '40s than it is today.
It was different.
What were some of the places that you kind of frequented on campus? The student union wasn't there yet when you got there, I guess.
No, it wasn't. It was just being completed, I guess. Hadn't been completed when I was a student. When I came back on the faculty, I think it had just been completed, 1952. Does that sound right?
Seemed like about 1950 was completed.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Bob, so maybe going back to academic side of it, you majored in what subject then?
Animal husbandry.
Animal husbandry.
Which is now animal science.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember some of your professors?
I remember some of my professors very well. I roomed for a couple of years at one of my professors' house. They had 4 rooms upstairs, and they rented out to eight boys. And Hilton Briggs, and he later became president of South Dakota State University, so he was a big influence in my life. Another professor I had was Jim Whatley. He later became Dean of Agriculture, but I took a genetics course under Dr. Whatley my last year in school. And he was such a good teacher. He just laid everything out so clearly that I was somewhat mesmerized, and beyond that, I didn't think I need to take any notes because everything was so clear, so I didn't. And on each hour exam, there were always 2 or 3 questions that I couldn't recall, and so I would make in the low 90s, 90, 91, 92. And since I planned to go to graduate school at that point, grades were important because I wanted to get some scholarships. And so come final exam time, I went to Dr. Whatley and said, "What do I have to make on the final exam to get an A in the course?" He got out his book and did a little figuring, and he said 100. So I got notes from E.J. Turman. You probably know E.J.
Well, knew E.J.
And in his notes was every word that Dr. Whatley had said. And there were the answers to the questions I'd missed. So I was ready for that final exam. Got my paper back, 99. As promised, I got a B. Well, that was in 1947. Now fast forward to 1997, 50 years later. I was visiting with a recent graduate, Julie McMahon from Arkansas, and Dr. Hilton Briggs that I mentioned a moment ago. And Julie was interested in learning something about the faculty members in years previous that had such a reputation, and she said, "How about Dr. Watley? What kind of a guy was he?" And I said, "Well, he was an outstanding researcher, nationally renowned, and he was an excellent teacher." And then I told her that story. And here was young Briggs just doubled over with laughter. He said, "Let me tell you the rest of the story." And he said, Jim Watley and I had offices adjoining, and after he finished grading your paper, well, he came in and told me what the background was. And he said, Totusek made 100 on this exam, but he's lazy. He didn't even take notes in my class. He needs to be stimulated to work a little harder. So I'm going to give him a 99. But just by sheer happenstance, I heard the rest of that story 50 years later.
Oh my God. How did you feel?
Well, I felt better. I never did worry too much about it because I thought, well, I just should have worked a little harder.
Well, I think of some could I say characters that I hear stories about from professors. You remember, say Hog Thompson,
Yes.
One of them, Fuzzy Hazen.
Yes.
Could you share some stories about these two individuals and others you can think of?
I didn't have a course under Fuzzy Hazen. I had my ag engineering under Pappy Diltz, who was another character at that time. He had a unique habit of when people began to doze off in an afternoon class, he was crippled and carried a cane that he laid on his desk. And when about half the class was asleep, well, he'd whack that cane on the desk and everybody would jump. Wouldn't go to sleep again that period anyway. Hog Thompson was a great storyteller. And as you probably know, in his later years, he was actually assigned to the president's office as an ambassador of goodwill, and he'd go out in the state and make a lot of speeches. And he loved to tell stories, and he was really good at telling them. And one of his big things, he always had philosophy in his speeches and in his stories. One of his big things was tell people now. If you appreciate them, tell them now. Don't wait till tomorrow. And then he illustrated that with this statement: flowers on the grave are like alimony on a cold night. You may need to censor that one.
No, that's great. That's great. Well, see, do you remember any of the fuzzyisms? Is that what they call Fuzzy Hazen? Some of his sayings were fuzzyisms. E.J. Terman, you mentioned, used to refer to some of his fuzzyisms.
My biggest recollection about Fuzzy Hazen is that he was totally for efficiency, and I didn't have a class under him. I would remember more. But he was about total efficiency, and his contention was that front doors in houses were a waste of time. They were unnecessary because you always parked it in the back, and at least at that time, and company came in the back door, so he didn't have a front door in his house on North Washington Street.
Yes. What about was Al Darlow dean when you were a student? What do you remember?
He actually was a department head who hired me for the faculty in 1952.
Then you become dean later.
And later, about a year later, he became dean.
Mm-hmm. Was it when you were a student there? He was.
Yes.
He was a professor.
Yes. Yes, he was head of department when I joined the faculty.
And it was animal husbandry.
Animal husbandry.
So what did you remember learning from him? I've heard some good stories about him.
He was a real interesting fellow. He had high expectations of people, and he was very frank. For example, Glenn Bratcher was named department head after Al was destined to go to the dean's office. And Glenn said, I want you to coach the judging team, livestock judging team. And I said, well, I'm not sure that I can do that adequately, because Glenn had been my coach and I had such a high regard for him. I knew I could not do it in the way he did it. And he said, well, go talk to Dr. Darlow. So I went in and told him that Mr. Bratcher wanted me to coach the livestock judging team. And he said, well, I don't know how much encouragement I can give you. He said, now, there wasn't any question in my mind when I asked Glenn Bratcher to be the coach that he could do it. But I'm just not sure about you. So that was a challenge. So I immediately was motivated to take the job. And for a little while, I wasn't sure that I'd done the right thing, but eventually.
Well, see, I want to come back to that. Let me kind of get back in the loop. So when you graduated in 48?
49.
In 49. And then you did your graduate work at Purdue, is that correct? Could you kind of maybe share a little bit about your Purdue experience?
Well, it was a great experience. And my major professor was Mac Beeson, W.M. Beeson, who was a graduate of OSU. Mm-hmm. He'd been on the judging team. And that year at Chicago, our team won the national contest. And I wasn't just real sure at that point. I wasn't definitely sure that I was going to do graduate work. I was holding that option open. But he was there when we were having our picture made, and he immediately offered me an assistantship. And so I decided on the spot to go to Purdue, and he was really an outstanding researcher and teacher.
So you're on the national championship livestock judging team?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And is that your senior year then?
Yeah.
Did any other years that you won the national championship while you were there?
No. Well, we won at Fort Worth. Mm-hmm. That's where all the teams in the country can participate. And Chicago actually at that time was called the International because there would be teams there from Canada also.
That's great. So you got the fellowship or the assistantship then to Purdue, and so you taught as you were doing the graduate work as well?
Yes, after the first year and a half I got an instructorship, which helped a good deal. And I taught then while working on my degree.
What did you specialize in? Your
nutrition.
Nutrition. Mm-hmm. And so animal nutrition, particularly cattle.
Yes, at that time it was across the board, but later on I specialized in cattle. Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So is there a story about how you got back from Purdue to Oklahoma State? Because you after you finished your doctorate, didn't you come directly back to Oklahoma State? Mm-hmm.
I guess the bottom line is I was offered a job. And I had such a high regard, of course, for OSU and the animal science department that I didn't hesitate.
And you said this was Dr. Darlow when he was department head?
Yes.
Invited you back? Okay.
Yes.
Great. Now, what classes when you first come back to Oklahoma State were you teaching?
I started out teaching the introductory animal science course, and then gradually progressed through several other courses, the sophomore level and the junior level and the senior level. And in total, by the time I had finished my teaching career there, I'd taught 14 different courses, including some seminar courses and orientation courses.
Bob, can you reflect back on what the department in the college was like in the early 50s? There was, I think, a lot of kind of retirement going on. It seemed like there was a lot of change. There was a lot of new professors coming on in the early 50s. What do you remember about the department in the college at that time?
Well, the College of Agriculture that I'm most familiar with and Animal Science Department had some really outstanding faculty members. Many of them went on to other places. Doyle Chambers, for example, went to LSU as a vice chancellor. Hilton Briggs, as I mentioned, went to South Dakota State eventually as president, and Bill Pope went to Texas A&M and was dean at New Mexico State after that. So really good good instructors. And one of my favorite stories about the teachers during that era came from Frank Robson. You know Frank?
Sure do.
Must have been in the early 80s, actually. I ran into Frank somewhere, and I don't know if he'd been back to OSU since he graduated. He probably had been, but he hadn't been back to animal science. So he started asking me about people. How about Jim Hillier? Well, he's retired. How about Lowell Walters? Well, he's retired. How about Bill Pope? Well, he's dean in New Mexico. How about Doyle Chambers? He's at LSU. And he finished the list and he looked me in the eye and he said, you know, you're the only SOB left there that I know. Only he didn't abbreviate. And so I thought, well, I better explain to him that we had a lot of really good young faculty members. Didn't sink in at all. He thought things had gone to pot. So I said, Frank, why don't you come to Stillwater and spend a day with me? He did. I toured him all of our facilities, went by the offices and introduced him to faculty members. And he left there that day convinced that the department had not gone to the dogs. So I got thinking, you know, there may be more Frank Robsons out there. So I started what I called VIP days. I'd invite people, not only graduates, but others, many of them leaders in the industry, to come in and spend a day and show them what we were doing and introduce them to faculty members. And it turned out to be a real productive endeavor in terms of letting people know what was going on.
Bob, who are some of the alumni that you were closely connected with over the years? I know there's, many, some stand out in your mind that you had relationships with.
That would be real difficult to narrow down to a few. You know, I've been fortunate in the era in which I was on the faculty to know earlier graduates and all of the graduates during my tenure there, and many of the graduates since I was on the faculty, because I've maintained some relationship, do have some contact with students. I actually knew graduates for 100 years, or projecting forward, it will be 100 years. For example, I knew some graduates in the early teens. 1913 was the earliest graduate that I knew, and he was still in his productive years, late in his career. But obviously the ones in the teens and the 20s and 30s, many of them I knew and worked with. And then going forward, of course, I either taught or was in administration for 38 years. Saw about 5,000 students go through during that era. And then 18 years since I've retired, I've known students. I know some of the freshmen there now. They'll graduate, some of them in 2012, some of them later. But you see, there's a span there of 100 years. So I've been extremely fortunate in knowing a lot of really outstanding graduates. And the ones that would stand out in my mind would take me a little time to.
Well, don't want you to leave anyone out of it. That's fine. I was asking a question because I know, my understanding, you were very active in, perhaps unlike some professors, not necessarily in your college, but across campus, but you were very active in external relations in terms of activities with alumni and people in the industry. Could you share some of the things that you did, some of the interactions you had? That's
a good question, because one of the things that I always admired about the Animal Science Department, and it goes back 100 years actually, was the great rapport that the department had with off-campus people, graduates and people in the industry. A good relationship, good rapport. I've been to a lot of other states where that isn't true or wasn't true. In some states that I've gone to, you could talk to people out in the state and they did not know any animal science faculty member. You could talk to the faculty members and they weren't acquainted with many producers. But in the Animal Science Department, not only the people officially in Extension, but everybody on the faculty had interaction, still do today, with the clientele. off campus. Even the basic researchers have many occasions to go out in the state and speak or help solve some producers' problems. So I've always cherished that component of our department. And beyond that, another thing that I really have admired about the department, again, this is as time elapses for 100 years, the department's been very well balanced between extension and research and teaching. And some departments have a real good reputation for one or the other of the three. But our department has been extremely well balanced, and just as an example of that, at one time when I was department head, we had 6 Regents professors in the department, 2 from extension, 2 from research, and 2 from teaching.
Bob, you had, what years were you? So you taught, you come back in
52.
52, and then when did you become department head in animal science?
1976.
1976, and then you
retired in 1990.
So you, wow, several years was that? Am I counting right? About 14 years or so?
As department head.
Department head.
Yeah.
Right. Well, as I recall, I'm not sure it's probably true today, but over the years, the animal husbandry / animal science department has been the largest department in terms of enrollment, isn't it, in the College of Agriculture?
Yes.
And has a strong national reputation.
And that's surprising. People would automatically think of engineering or accounting or whatever. And back in the early days of the university, of course, it was logical that the ag departments be strong because it was the biggest industry at that time. But more recently, that is a surprise to many people. We have current time about 700 students, and interestingly enough, they come typically from 35 to 38 states.
Wow.
This year, for example, livestock judging team, 7 members from 7 different states.
Well, Bob, two questions, and I want to come back to the judging team in a minute. What were some of your goals, when you as department head, that you had, the kind of vision you had of the department? Could you share some of those?
My primary goal was not to do too much damage and
do no harm.
do no harm, and to maintain the high level of excellence that I perceived throughout my association with OSU. But I did, I think, initiate some innovative programs, and that's not always easy. Faculty members have a tendency to be conservative, and I was. And I didn't have many problems in my own mind when I was department head, but one of the things that being the impatient person that I am, that really bothered me was that when a new idea was developed, maybe it would take a year or two to develop and gain acceptance from the faculty, because the worst thing you could do was implement something without faculty agreement. But it's easy to see, something new may work and it may not.
What were some of those initiatives and innovations that you're referring to?
We, when I became department head, we had 3 options in the department: science, production, and what was the other one? Maybe we just had 2. But we gradually started adding more options until we had about 10. We would create a business option, for example, because we were in an era when business was becoming increasingly important. And so that option would include a lot of courses in the College of Business Administration and Agricultural Economics. We developed a science option where the emphasis was on science, especially important for those going to graduate school. We had one that we called livestock promotions, which involved courses taken from ag communications and journalism to appeal to those students who wanted to get into the things such as writing and radio and television work and serving with breed associations and that sort of thing. Developed a food option. And so we developed, and we of course had to establish a pre-veterinary medicine option. And so this allowed students to concentrate in the area of their interest. I think that's one of the important things.
In your tenure that you reestablished the horse program,
Yes.
animal science, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that's another thing that wasn't real easy because horses are not food animals. And our department, for lo those many years, had been geared toward food animals. But in Oklahoma, we have more horses, and did then, per square mile than any state in the country. And in terms of economic impact, horses were only behind beef cattle. They were ahead of dairy, they were ahead of wheat, anything else you want to mention. And so it seemed logical, and we had a lot of students interested in horses because they came off of ranches, and many who did not come off of ranches wanted to learn more about horses. So it looked obvious that we needed a horse program, but again, that's one of those things that took a little incubation. And at that time, I was fortunate in having Frank Baker as dean, and he shared the same opinion that we needed a horse program. So,
was there any coordination with the equine program at Vet Med College as part of that at all?
No, except that our faculty members worked with the people in veterinary medicine quite closely, but more on research than on teaching.
Well, something that strikes me that's probably pretty innovative, you're talking about the new options that you included in the animal science majors. You're having to reach across not only departmental but college lines. Did you need support from the dean on that? I mean, how did that work?
No, the dean was very receptive. Jim Watley was dean when I became department head.
You know, speaking of deans, can you share a little bit of some of your insights? And you worked with how many different deans? I can probably with both hands to take to count them probably. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the deans you worked with?
Al Darlow, of course, we've mentioned. And when I joined the faculty, it was Dean Blizzard.
Yes,
who was dean. And then after Darlow, would it have been Jim Watley and Frank Baker and Charles Browning.
Browning, sure.
And sometimes senility is an inconvenience.
No, it's okay.
The fellow who came from Texas Tech.
What do you remember about some of the strengths and that each of the different deans that you work with brought to it? I mean, of course, Blizzard was sort of almost a legend when he at OSU. He was
Yes.
there for years.
And due to an automobile accident, he wasn't real active at that time. Most of the work was picked up by the associates. And so I didn't really get real well acquainted with him. A couple of interesting things about W.L. Blizzard. He was always known as Dean Blizzard. He was department head, animal science department head, when the animal husbandry building was constructed in 1922. Well, in subsequent years, people would come in the animal husbandry building and wondered why the doorknobs were so low, just remarkably low. Well, the reason was that Dean Blizzard was a man of small stature, about 5'4".
Oh my!
And so he made the doorknobs at a height that was convenient for him.
Great story.
And there's another interesting story about Dean Blizzard. Again, this was when he was department head. A German chap from Waukomis, who still had a German accent, came over to see well, it wasn't Doctor, it was Mr. Blizzard, W.L. Blizzard. So the secretary took him into the office, and he looked Dean over, and he said, Well. So this is the famous blizzard. It wasn't a big storm, was it? And the report from the secretary was that upset Mr. Blizzard.
And I said, what sort of Al Darlow? Maybe what do you remember about Dean Arlo?
Yes, he was very enjoyable to work with because he was very mission oriented, and he was very frank, and you always knew what the goals were and where you stood. Come in.
Some of the kind of, we said we were going to come back to, but I want to ask you again about we talked about Dean Blizzard and his, of course, in his earlier years, he was a famous coach for livestock judging teams, and they won for many years. You served, as you indicated earlier on, not served, but was one of the judging team members, won a national championship. But I think then as faculty member, you were a coach for about 12 years?
No, only 8 years.
8 years. It just seemed like 12.
That's right.
But now, out of those 8 years, you won something like 10 national and international competitions, as I recall?
I doubt if it was that many, but we were fortunate to win several, and it wasn't hard to do given the caliber of students we had. We never entered a contest, but what I thought, if I had done a good job of coaching, we should win the contest.
Some of the names you remember on your teams?
Oh, some of these guys went on to great success. In fact, they all did in one way or another. On that first team, I had people like John McKnight, who was a cattleman. He became president of the American Hereford Association and president of the American Brangus Association. Ronnie Blackwell, who became the CEO of the American Quarter Horse Association, the biggest breed association in the world, and his editor was Audie Rackley, who was also on a judging team. And just a little while later, on a subsequent team, I have a fellow named Eddie Kimbrell, and I always held him up as a good example. He came off of a poor hill farm at Mountain View, Oklahoma. I think they had 80 acres. And on Sunday mornings, there were 4 boys in the family. They went to church on a tractor. Their dad had built a little box to put on the back of the tractor, and 2 of the boys rode on the hood. And they went to church. They went on a tractor because they didn't own an automobile. So Eddie came to school and made his own way, all the way. And that was true of a lot of kids during the 50s and 60s, especially. It continues on today. He eventually became the second in command in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And, we can talk about success stories of a similar kind all day. One of the fellows I had on the team was a fellow named Tom Reese. He was in ROTC when he was in school. He held down 3 jobs. He was the 9th of 13 kids from Moreland, Oklahoma. He held 3 jobs. He was called into service because he took advanced ROTC, went into the Air Force. And when he retired as a 2-star general, and his latest assignment was commanding general of the North American Defense Command. So, they didn't always stay in agriculture, but many of them succeeded at whatever endeavor they chose.
Bob, obviously, I think you're being a little modest, and your coaching was pretty good too. But you had some outstanding kids. Did you kind of prep these kids? I mean, did you look for good students coming through, and how did you select the members of your team?
Well, it was an open deal.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who wanted to come out for the livestock judging team could come out.
Mm-hmm.
We worked all day Saturday, starting the day after the international, which would have been the second Saturday after Thanksgiving. I'd typically have 60 or 70 kids come out. And most of them would usually stay until the Christmas workouts, which involved about a week of workouts, excepting Christmas Day, sometimes 10 days. And that would call the group usually down to about 30. And most of those would usually stay with it. And keep in mind that in the early days, I only used one team, as most people did. In other words, I'd select 7 team members to go to the first contest in Denver. Might change 1 or 2 at the next contest or the subsequent contest, but typically it didn't involve more than 10 for the whole year. But most of those 30 would keep coming out throughout because of the experience they thought they were getting.
Well, what do you feel like was kind of key to your success in coaching these young men?
That's easy. Good students.
Kind of coach, recruit good athletes.
Outstanding students, and that continues to today. There have been some changes. I mentioned 60 people would typically come out for the team then. Today it's more like 12 or 15 because I guess students have more diversions now, more distractions maybe, and maybe that's not fair. Maybe they get involved in more things, but it's really a huge commitment to go out for that judging team. You have to maintain your regular classes, but you're going every Saturday and a lot of times in the evening, and you miss the football games, the basketball games during that workout period, which runs from a year, from the spring until fall. And so it takes a special kind of student. Number one, they've got to be capable or they're not going to succeed, but they also have to have a tremendous sense of dedication and work ethic.
Another subject, I'm trying to recall, did you do in your research, you're a pretty prolific publisher of research, I want to say over maybe 200, somewhere in the neighborhood of publications.
I don't recall the number, but quite a few, again, because I had good graduate students. And I had the luxury of having access to facilities that allowed me, in my case, to have a lot of research cattle. Cattle are difficult to do research with because they require so much land. And we were fortunate to not only have about 10,000 acres available at Lake Carl Blackwell, but also about 6,800 acres at Fort Reno, which we had sole access to for research during those years. So I had the luxury of having a lot of cattle, and that allowed me to do a lot of research.
What about funding for your research? Were these basically grants from the college funding them? Did you get money from industry?
At that time, there was not a lot of funding from the federal agencies. And there weren't too many grants of any kind. I did get some grants from industry, pharmaceutical companies, from breed organizations, cattlemen's organizations, but it wasn't the high dollar type grants.
Did you get release time for any of your research, or is that just on your own time?
That's, I mentioned, took a huge commitment on the part of the students. It also did on the part of the coach, because that was essentially extracurricular activity. You got no credit for the Saturday workouts and sometimes Sunday afternoon workouts. You got no credit for the travel, which made it challenging because you not only had to arrange for time away before you left, but then catch up when you got back. But I did quite a few things that were more or less extracurricular. At one time, I was advisor to about 100 students, in charge of student employment in the department, which involved about 100 students, in charge of job placement. And so I kept real busy. It was a challenge to do research.
And so your research, I mean, you were not, your teaching load wasn't being lowered to do research.
No, actually, you got credit for the organized research. You got credit for teaching. You got credit for extension. But there was no additional credit for these extracurricular.
So you were judge and team coach, working with about 100 students, helping with student employment, advising about another 100, and then doing your research and then teaching. And wow.
That's why.
Yeah. That's incredible, Bob.
That's why I said I was fortunate to have really good graduate students, because they had to carry a lot of the research load.
I think you're being a little modest, but what was some of the nature of some of your publications? Obviously in the animal science field, but you had some specialty areas that you researched and published primarily?
One of the areas that I did a lot of research on was cattle type. We were in an era where cattle were changing type from cattle that were too small, rapidly going to cattle that ultimately became too big. We were going from cattle that in many cases did not produce enough milk to get real high growth rate in calves to cattle that gave a lot of milk. So I did a lot of research involving cattle of different sizes and different milk production potentials to kind of define what was an efficient, profitable type. And involved in this scenario was a couple of national beef cattle conferences we did in the 1980s that brought about 800 people to the campus nationwide. So that was one of the areas of emphasis for me.
Was foraging in any of you, I mean, in your animal science, range management, any of that?
Yes. Part of my research was evaluating various supplements that enabled the cattle to best utilize the forage on the range. And again, we had tremendous range resources at Lake Harbor, Blackwell, and Fort Reno.
Bob, what, sort of off another tangent, but while you were still there, the spirit rider concept come in. Do you remember some of the evolution of that? Because it came out of the College of Agriculture, and I think even out of maybe out of your department, and some of those Eddie's last name who was active with that.
He was in ag education.
Ag education.
Yeah, he was really the driving force faculty-wise for the involvement of that rider. In our department, we were involved by virtue of sometimes providing the horse. And the facilities to stall the horse and assistance of that kind.
That's what I was thinking. What do you remember that that's become a big, huge fan favorite now for sporting events, particularly in football?
That's right.
What do you remember about the inception? Did you hear some of the early conversations about that? What do you remember?
Well, I remember this about the spirit rider. At the point when the bronze was created, that is located there between the Wrestling Hall of Fame and Gallagher-Iba, there was a lot of reservation on campus about the appropriateness of that sort of mascot, if you will, in an era where things had become more sophisticated.
Right. Okay. Well, what do you out of the? We talked earlier about some of the deans you worked with. So I'm kind of not only the deans, but just some of the faculty members you worked with through the years. Are there some individuals that, and maybe university administrators that you work with, presidents, others, vice presidents, that stand out in your mind over your lengthy career at OSU?
I guess I enjoyed working for all of the deans in different ways, and we did have some good deans, some good presidents, let's see, when I joined the faculty, I guess Dr. Bennett was on leave with the .4 program, and Al Darlow, during some of those years, was vice president, and that may have been after Dr. Wilhelm became president. But I enjoyed working under all of the presidents.
What do you remember about Dr. Wilhelm? He come out of ag background.
Yes, he did. And I didn't have a course under him. I was just a year or two late to have a course under him. But the thing I remember about him, when I enrolled, at that time he was enrolling every student that came into agriculture. He was vice dean. And it's well known, of course, that he had a tremendous memory. And I could repeat this story hundreds of times, but I had one student by the name of Ray Billingsley, whom Dr. Wilhelm enrolled. 3 months later, Ray had some cattle on the Wichita stockyards, and Dr. Wilhelm had a layover there, and he came out stockyard just as a matter of interest. Ray saw him coming down the aisle. He was in his dirty overalls. He said, well, I'm not going to embarrass Dr. Wilhelm by even acknowledging that I know him, you know. Well, as they got close, Dr. Wilhelm said, well, hello, Ray, how are things at Winoka? And I asked him once, you always mention the person's hometown when you mention their name. Looks like to me that just makes twice as many things to remember. He said, no, that helps me with the connection. And invariably, he always knew where we were from.
Great guy, wasn't he?
Yeah, tremendous. I can tell you a story about his son.
Okay. Richard.
Richard. The first year I joined the faculty, he was taking the junior courses. Glenn Bratcher taught one of these courses, a animal evaluation course, judging course, if you will. But he was gone so much that I was his assistant, and I actually handled the class. At the end of the semester, Glenn said, go ahead and make out the grades. And he said, this is the way I do it. You can do it however you want to. This is kind of an unusual course because it's more difficult to assess the students, and it's a course that is kind of difficult for some students. And so he said, I give A's, B's, and C's unless somebody doesn't attend class or really goofs up. And he said, this is the way I assign the grades. I rank them in numerical order, highest to the lowest. He said, as you go down through there, about a third of the way down, you'll find a big gap. Big gap, big spread. He said, that's where I draw the line. People below that line are B's. Then I draw another line about another third of the way down, separating the B's from the C's. And he said, I don't have any names with those grades. I just have the ranking. And then I put the names back to those scores and make out the grades. He said, that way I'm not influenced by the student. Well, I did that, and the first name under that A list was Richard Wilhelm.
First one.
First
I,
one.
IB.
And so I said, well, you know, I better take this to Glenn. So I took the grades to him. I said, you better look at these. He said, did you do the grades like I do? Yes. He said, well, that's okay. So the next semester, Richard Wilhelm got a B in the second semester of that same course. And so I always took the blame for the only two B's he made as an undergraduate. I felt bad about it. And I never did tell him what actually evolved on that until about 4 or 5 years ago, if you can believe that.
Oh my gosh.
But then the rest of the story is, a couple of years ago, Joe Whiteman was in the hospital. And I was visiting him there, and pretty soon he said, you know, I've never told anybody this story. He said, I had Dick Wilhelm in the second semester of junior judging, and when I made out the grades, he had a B. And I thought, well, you know, he's the son of the president. I better take another look at this. And then he said, I thought I better be true to my principles. So he gave him a B. But all that time, I just assumed that I did the same thing the second semester, you know.
Right.
So then I had to go back to Richard Wilhelm and tell him that I just took half of the blame.
That's great. So let me get. Well, what you know, over the years, and all of the, you got to have a lot of special memories. Any of them stand out in your mind more than others that were special to you?
Well, of course, I was blessed to work with good students and good fellow faculty members and good clientele. But I also had the good fortune of being able to travel and meeting a lot of interesting people over the country. For example, on one occasion, I was at an Angus field day held at J.C. Penney's farm. He not only had stores, but he also had Guernsey dairy cattle, and he had Angus cattle. And his Angus place was on the Hudson River near Rhinebeck. And I went there to speak at that field day, and Mr. Penney was there. He was about 93, I think, at the time. Very vigorous, booming voice. You know, the rest of us used a PA system, and he disdained that. And during the course of the day, I had a chance to visit with him several times. And he told me he had something over 3,000 stores. And I said, Mr. Penney, with 3,000 stores, what's your biggest problem? He said, my young managers. I said, what? He said, they're resistant to change. I said, what? He said, yeah, my young managers are the most resistant to change. Now, it blew my mind, you know. So I went back home and thought about that. And now I found that in our own faculty, that was a situation to some extent. And then I realized why. You know, the older faculty members were secure, they had tenure, they had a lot of experience to fall back on, and they might think, well, you know, this might fit in. This might be good. But the young faculty members, you know, they didn't have tenure, they didn't have that experience, and they just were hesitant to take a risk, you know. And I noticed that the most resistant to change on campus were the students. And I found that in the departmental clubs. You know, if something had been going on for 40 years, it might have died, but they didn't want to bury it. So that really precipitated a new perspective. You know, old people are always thought of as resistant to change. That's not always true. Let me mention another off-campus person that was interesting. I was in Georgia for a talk to the Georgia Cattlemen's Association. They were meeting in Augusta, and the night before they had a reception, and I was going through the hors d'oeuvre line, and a fellow next to me nudged me, and he said, that's Miss Lillian sitting over there. I said, who? He said, Miss Lillian, Jimmy Carter's mother. I said, okay. You know, I wasn't aware of the politics of the thing so much at that time. And when I finished the hors d'oeuvre line, why, I looked over there and she motioned at me. So I went over there and she said, have a seat. And we visited, and pretty soon she said, you're not from around here, are you? I said, well, no. How did you decide that? She said, well, I noticed you only took one helping of each hors d'oeuvre. And so we visited some more, and then she looked at me and she said, you're a Republican, aren't you? And I kind of sheepishly admitted that I was, and I said, how could you tell? She said, I could see it in your eyes. And I again was kind of apologetic, and she said, oh, that's okay. She said, I like Republicans. Jimmy doesn't, but I do.
That's a great story. Well, what are some of the significant events in the life of the college and university that you recall in your half century, you know, nearly with the college? There's some, you know, not achievements or accomplishments, just events. People that go on campus, special activities.
Well, one of the most significant eras during my tenure there was 1957, when the first Sputnik orbited the Earth, and And there was a sudden, intense move towards more science. OAMC became OSU, and animal husbandry became animal science, and that same situation was apparent all across the country.
Bob, how did you feel about the name change from Oklahoma A&M to Oklahoma State University?
Well, I didn't have any reservations about that at all.
Did some of the old Aggies kind of disdain that new title a little bit?
That's right. I mean, I could appreciate the necessity for increased emphasis on the basic sciences, and so I thought it was very appropriate. And the same with our name change in the department. The only reservation I had about the name change in the department was animal science. But animal science is so much more than science. It's business and it's production and management. So that's the only reservation I had about that name change. But I don't know what it could have been, without being a long name.
Bob, how would you hope people remember you? I mean, of all the activities you did and all the things, how do you hope people remember Bob Totusek? Huh?
Well, going back to my early comments, I'll hope they didn't think I did too much damage, and at least maintain the level of the department, because it is a good department. I was extremely blessed to work for a great university in a great department. I'm one of those fortunate people, and I didn't realize how few they are in this country, of loving to go to work every day.
What parts of your job give you the most satisfaction?
Working with people, students, faculty members, grad students, staff members, and the clientele off campus.
Industry people, alumni, and just working with people.
That's what made the job fun. The challenge is you could get along with for the privilege of working with all these great people.
What do you attribute to that? I mean, some people would really say, let me do my teaching, let me do my research, but just, I don't want to mess with the relationships. So what makes you feel the way you do about it? And I see the smile in your eyes, and that you really enjoy working with people. Why do you think you enjoy this?
Well, I think it's a privilege of every faculty member to work for people in Oklahoma. And to do that, they need to know what the problems are in animal agriculture in Oklahoma, and have a hand in solving those problems. Now, the alternative is, in the science area, for example, is for a person to only worry about the research that he or she is doing and not worry about what applies to Oklahoma. But my contention is that in a large part, the taxpayers of Oklahoma pay our salary as faculty members, and so our first obligation should be to them. And that doesn't mean that you slight your own area of expertise. You're just aware of the greater picture, the bigger picture.
I felt like your first allegiance was not necessarily to the discipline, although you give everything to you, but your first responsibility was to the people of Oklahoma.
Right.
Well, are there any special memories you have that, I mean, you must have so many, but there's got to be some aha experience, some mountaintop experiences that you had?
I'm sorry, I'm not doing a very good job of sorting those out, because there have been so many. I'll mention one staff member in our department. He's a manager of our swine education and research center, Kim Brock.
Yeah, I know Kim.
He's
my neighbor.
Had the privilege of hiring Kim, and my thought at that time, and I still think that way, that he could have than anything that he aspired to. And I mean, no ceiling. You know, Dean, I was thinking about academia, especially Dean, college president. He had that kind of ability. So for several years, I'd really try to get Kim to take graduate courses to work on that MS and then a PhD. And he took a few, but he wasn't real enthusiastic about it. And finally I said, whoa, wait a minute. You're always telling these students in seminar that the most important thing in life is to do what you like. Nothing else is close. And here's a guy doing exactly what he likes. Leave him alone.
Good story. Good story.
And he's the best in the country at what he does.
Bob, how have you seen your field in animal science change over the years from the time you got into the profession till now? What major changes have you seen and experienced?
Well, a gradual change to more emphasis on science, and admittedly, science was evolving during that time. It wasn't a matter of ignoring it, but it's just a matter of it just beginning to evolve. For example, the first PhD awarded at Oklahoma State University was in animal science, about 1948. First PhD. And that's a reflection, of course, of research and science. And some of our early faculty members, like Jim Whatley and Hilton Briggs, came on in the latter part of the 30s, and they were instrumental in establishing research programs. So it wasn't a matter of ignoring the basics. It's just a matter of them evolving as the department grew and progressed. And also the same is true of business. You know, there hadn't been much emphasis on business in the early years, but it gradually became apparent that the students needed more business. For example, suggested this to our faculty, and as I told you earlier, sometimes it's slow to get faculty to change, but we implemented requiring 2 courses in accounting and implemented the business option. So those are some of the changes that evolved over time.
What do you see the future for the College of Agriculture at Oklahoma State University?
Well, I think it's got a tremendous future for obvious reasons. You know, people have to eat. It's that simple. And it's always a challenge. You know, agriculture is criticized a good deal for one thing, for being the recipient of some subsidies, so to speak. The situation, and I'm against subsidies. I was in New Zealand a couple of times, for example, and one of those times was when everything was heavily subsidized. And there was talk of stopping subsidies at that time, and it happened. But the livestock producers in New Zealand, especially the sheep producers, are big in sheep, were just scared to death. Next time I went back, it had happened, and they had developed a lot stronger market for their lambs than when they had subsidies, because they had to promote their product, they had to produce a product that appealed to the consumer, and they were just a lot better off. So I'm against subsidies. But one of the reasons probably for some subsidies in agriculture here is because many other countries in the world market have subsidies for agriculture, many times real big. And the other thing, of course, from a pragmatic standpoint, agriculture is the only industry where you buy retail and sell wholesale. And with an abundance of food, there is much less leverage for agriculture to command higher prices. So agriculture production has always been a tough business. But again, people need to eat. In the future, there'll probably be a better place for agriculture.
Always like a bumper sticker says, you're never further away from agriculture than your next meal. I always thought that was very appropriate.
That's right.
Well, it's story time. We've got an opportunity. You have just a wealth of knowledge and stories, and some of them you probably can't tell, but some of them that you can. Could you just share some of your stories, some of your experiences through the years?
Well, as I said, I was blessed to work at a great university for a great department. And we talked about having more students than a department in the university. Would you let me just mention 2 or 3 things that is the reason for that? Of course, the department has had a good reputation over the years, and especially in teaching. The teaching faculty in our department has always had a close personal relationship with students. And people hear about that not only on campus, but over the country. And so they appreciate that. And I mentioned that we have students typically from 35 to 38 states. And that reputation as a good teaching faculty is a factor. But also, there are a couple more. We still have animals in the department. And that may sound kind of strange, but it's important because students like to work with animals if they're interested in animals. And we have the luxury at OSU of having access to resources that allows us to have animals. And many departments around the country now have no animals or very few animals. So that attracts students. Mm-hmm. Another thing is we still have a number of judging teams, competitive judging teams that have a good reputation. And a lot of kids want to continue judging because they see the benefits in it. So a lot of students from all over the country come to OSU for that reason. And we've had students, I think, from every state in the country. Vermont was the last one, other than Alaska and Hawaii. And by the same token, we have graduates that disperse all over the country and in the world. A few years ago, we kind of checked this out, and at that time we had graduates in every state except Alaska. We weren't aware of one in Alaska, and 16 other countries.
Share the story about the Rhode Island.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah, let's hear the Rhode Island story, Bob.
Well, for a long time, we didn't have a student from Rhode Island, and all of a sudden, Howard Tucker shows up. Howard's from Slocum, Rhode Island, which is just west of Providence. His dad had 1,000 acres of rich potato land, and Howard hated potatoes, so he wanted to come somewhere where hogs were important because he loved hogs. But he was a very unique individual. In class, at first I thought he was disruptive because every 2 or 3 minutes at Howard's hand, he had a question. And I gradually realized how important he was compared to some other students because he brought out an opportunity to put an emphasis on certain points. And so I grew to really appreciate Howard. But after he graduated, he moved back home. His dad wouldn't have any part of having hogs on his potato farm. And he wouldn't loan him any money to go outside. So Howard got a loan, rented a 80-acre field, and started producing hogs on a small basis. But anyway, about 3 years after he graduated, I visited him there. And we were sitting in his living room, and as usual, Howard was very talkative. And all of a sudden, he stopped and just stared out into space for a couple of minutes, and I didn't know what was going on. And finally he said, "I'm going to tell you." He said, "I don't think they'll take my degree away from me at this point, so I'm going to tell you." Well, Howard's job for the Block and Bridle Rodeo that year was to take care of the buggy horse, which was kept at the beef barn, and each evening he'd take that buggy horse and go down to the arena and hook up to the buggy and do some practice runs around the arena. On this one occasion, he got the horse and was on the way back, or on the way to the arena, and he remembered he'd forgotten his billfold. And he lived there, I think, in Drummond Hall, right across the street from Beef Barn. And so he went up to the door, and a guy came outside and said, "Hey, buddy, would you hold my horse for just a couple of minutes? I left my billfold upstairs and I need to go get it." The fellow said, "Well, I don't have time." But he said, "Why don't you just take your horse with you? There's nobody else around here to help you." So Howard said, "I don't know what possessed me, but I took the horse inside with this guy's help, got on the elevator, punched 8, which is my floor, and the elevator stopped on 7 because somebody had punched the button. Doors opened up, and he said, 'Going up,' and this guy just about panicked and said, 'Not now.' and Howard went on up to 8, and the doors opened, and actually this was a little different than maybe the story you've heard before. He thought, 'Oh my gosh, what am I doing? What am I doing?' And so he didn't even take the horse off. He just punched it first floor and went down. And he was still fortunate there wasn't anybody around. And he got the horse back outside, and he said it was really tough for one person to go through 2 double doors with the horse. And he got the horse outside the door. No sooner had he gotten there than this police car came up and pulled up and stopped. And Howard thought, this is the end of my time at OSU. I won't get a degree. My dad's not going to be happy. And the policeman rolled the window down and said, "Fella, would you please get your horse away from that dorm? We don't like them that close to the dorm."
Well, you got to have a lot of the good stories like that, Bob. Share some.
Oh, they're a lot of good ones. You know, the thing that impressed me about so many of our students back in the 50s and continuing on in later years, and as I mentioned earlier, it's still true today. A lot of students in animal science go through without any help, period. And we're blessed in the department in having a lot of livestock units and a lot of laboratories. And so about 100 students can work in the laboratory or work and live at one of the livestock units with no rent, and sometimes a capability of food preparation, a 2-burner stove and a microwave, a little refrigerator. And so they can make it through by working in the summertime. And I learned early on not to ever give up on a student. One particular year, there was a student who worked at the beef barn, and he would almost make his grades each year, but not quite, so he'd be put on probation. And he'd go out and work and get some more money and come back, and maybe he'd make his grades to stay in, and maybe he wouldn't, but it was off and on. I think it took him 7 years to get that degree. Didn't know what in the world we would do with him. I was in charge of job placement. But he disappeared at graduation time, didn't come by, for help or anything. And at the same time, there was another young man, I'm not going to mention their names, who I thought was just about that close to being an outlaw. He never did get in trouble with the law, but just kind of always a rebel, and kind of hard to manage. Didn't know what he would develop into, didn't know where he'd go. Again, he didn't come by. And about 5 years later, I was down in Jackson, Mississippi for some meetings, and they had a trade show there. And I started down through that trade show. A fellow hollered at me, "Hey, Dr. Totusek," and came running over and he said, "We've got one of your students that's just doing a heck of a job." "Yeah, what's his name?" And he mentioned that first guy that I mentioned. So the light came on, I hadn't gone 50 steps, and another fellow did the same thing. "Hey, Dr. Totusek, we've got one of your graduates that's just outstanding, really got a good work ethic and very productive. What's his name?" It was the second guy I mentioned. So I learned never to give up on him. But the
did
thing
you ever
is,
find any more about those two guys, Bob? Did you ever get any more background on them? I mean,
well, they're both still doing very
do they
well.
well?
Yeah. And you know, we tend to think when we're in the classroom, we tend to revere those people who make A's. You know, we kind of hold them up as the epitome because it not only means that they're smart, but they benefited from our teaching, you know, and
Sure,
so we
absolutely.
feel good about them. But I've noticed so many students who maybe were 2.5 students, and I can mention several that just barely got over that 2 point, that just made outstanding citizens and really successful professionals. So over the years, you know, I began to view this thing of grades differently. Of course, we always appreciated the students with good grades, especially if they wanted to go on to grad school. But I knew there was a place for all of them. And the thing that I noticed really impressed me during the 50s and 60s, I started to say a while ago, I got sidetracked. So many of those kids came off of poor farms and made their own way through school. Had one or two jobs, sometimes three, no scholarships, you know. The only help they had was working for the department, which was important.
You know, some of our significant donors, Bob, that way. I mean, we're, you know, thank goodness they passed.
That's exactly right.
It's surprising how they turn out. Absolutely. Bob, what, gosh, again, you've got such a span. Is there anything we haven't covered? I mean, some things that you'd like to share? I mean, this is kind of opportunity. It's open mic time, so you know, we won't have to do karaoke. But if you got anything you want to share,
one of my favorite grade stories involves me, so I hesitate to tell it. But it was interesting to me at the time. My major professor looked at my transcript and thought I was a prime candidate for a fast track of some kind. So he put me in this organic chemistry course that only chem engineers and chemists took. And I didn't know a soul in there. But this guy came in the first day of class and here's the book we're using. I wrote it. There's no need for me to lecture because you can read it in the book. And here's a scenario. We have lecture Tuesdays and Thursdays. On Tuesdays, I'll answer questions for 20 minutes and then we'll have a quiz the rest of the hour. On Thursdays, we'll have an hour exam. That was every week. And I wasn't a chemist. And I worked really hard. It wasn't unusual to stay up till 2 or 3 o'clock working. And I couldn't make much above a 50. I never made a grade over a 60. And you know what I was thinking. Well, Glenn Bratcher came through there that fall near the end of the semester and he said, "How you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm doing okay except for organic chemistry. I'm flunking it." Well, the next spring I went back to OSU and ran into Glenn and he said, "How did you come out in that organic chemistry course?" And I sheepishly said, "Well, I got an A in it." He said, "I'm never going to believe anything you tell me again." But here's the scenario. I didn't know anybody else in there. He graded on the curve. And I actually ended up with the highest grade in that class because I was so scared. And the other thing that contributed to my A was we had to identify 2 unknowns in there, and I was not a good lab man. I didn't care much for laboratory at all. We had 2 unknowns, which means you get a little vial of a compound material, and you have to identify it through a series of chemical tests, get it right down to what it is. You know, it could be salt, just as a simple example. Well, again, I put in a lot of long weekends, and I got both of mine, and I was the only one that got them both. And that's shows you what fear will do. Fear and ignorance. I was ignorant of what was going on, you know.
Fear
with
can
other
be a good
people.
thing sometimes. Huh? That's a good story. Great. Bob, I think I know you well enough. You're probably not an advice kind of guy, but what would you share with your colleagues in the department now and in the college, I won't say advice, but what suggestions would you have, and just, what experience and wisdom would you pass on to them?
Work hard and be ethical in everything you do.
Be good. Anything else?
I'll think of some more things tomorrow. Can I come back?
Okay. Okay.
We talked about our students coming from many states. We also have graduates that go into many states. Maybe I mentioned that before. But we've always had a good demand for our graduates. And I think one reason is because our previous graduates have done such a good job that people take note of that and come to us. And a lot of people take note that many of our graduates don't end up in animal agriculture. We have a lot, of course, who do in animal agriculture, and production, and research, and the food industry, and so on. But we also have quite a few graduates that go into veterinary medicine, and surprisingly, quite a few who go into medicine. There have been times when we've had graduates who couldn't get into vet medicine, but got into med school, and it's because they have a good background of science, chemistry, and biology, genetics, nutrition, and so on. But we also have quite a few students who go to law school, and that's interesting. One reason is because a law degree will allow them to practice anywhere. If they want to go back to their hometown, they can do that. So we encourage a lot of them to do that. And another thing is that we have some courses that I think help people to prepare to go into any field. Courses that cause students to think. In our judging courses, for example, they learn to observe, gather facts, evaluate those facts, and make a decision in a very short time. And then also in a very short time, like 2 minutes in the case of all reasons, defend their placing. I've had a number of people who've gone to law school who told me that that was a real asset to them. It's also a real asset in any managerial activity. So we have people in life insurance business, you name it, and they credit a lot of their success many times to these courses. A case in point, about 5 years ago, a young man who graduated in the 80s looked me up, made a special point to track me down. And he said the most important educational activity I had to prepare me for law school was those judging courses I took. He said there's very little difference between a 2-minute set of oral reasons and the closing argument in the courtroom. And this guy was an assistant district attorney in one of the metropolitan areas in Oklahoma. So, I think that there are some unique things that have allowed us to enjoy a good job market for our graduates.
Great. Anything else?
That's it.
Okay.